why do you think why do you think it's crazy now already with AI? Like I was like, when I asked you before, I was like, oh, when do you think it's gonna get crazy? And you were like, what are you talking about? It's fucking crazy now.
Yeah, I think like anything, there's never, like if you look back at history, it's always easy in hindsight to be like, that was the singular moment where shit got really wild. Like you look back at history and you're like, yeah, that's the year Microsoft was founded and that was like this moment. But in the moment, nobody knew about fucking Microsoft, right? Like these things are just happening all the time. So in hindsight, I think it's really easy to like pinpoint like, holy shit, that was something really insane. But I mean, just the capabilities of ChatGPT now, even if you contrast to how capable it was like a year ago. Like even a year ago, it was like good and it could generate some code. Like there's a Microsoft thing now. I can't remember if it started out as Microsoft, but it essentially built on the same technology as ChatGPT, right? It's built on these general purpose transformers. And it was just trained on like a massive amount of code, right? Like most code that is, well, closed source or even open source ends up on this place called GitHub, and it's just like, it's like Wikipedia for code, kind of. You can track your own projects, you can make publicly open source software, whatever. There's just like a huge abundance of code, and they trained this thing called Copilot on this. So think like a very early version of ChatGPT, but just solely for the purpose of code, right? And so you could, in your little, text editor where you're writing code, you could like ask it to do a thing where you describe like, I want this piece of code to do this, and it would sort of regurgitate something along those lines. But when it first started, it was kind of like, it was just regurgitating things that it's seen. So if you were doing like a really common task that there was like thousands of examples of people doing this thing already, it would just spit that out really well. And there was projects I was working on where I was working on that sort of code. I was working in a language called JavaScript, and I was writing Firebase code, and like it's just super common, lots of examples of it on the internet. And it would spit out like actually really decent quality code for that. But if you asked it to do anything where it required any like intuition or actually contextual understanding of like anything than just like regurgitating things it's seen, it actually had to like understand your question and then like come up with something real.
Right.
It didn't do that at all.
Right.
And now we're sitting here a year later, you can ask ChatGPT that prompt. And it understands context. Like I've asked ChatGPT to write code for me, and it writes the code, and I look at the code and I'm like, that doesn't work, that's wrong. And then I think through it, I run the code, I see it work, and I'm like, wait a minute. And it's written it in a better way than I thought to write it in the first place.
Crazy.
And it like understands the context crazy. And you can even ask it, like, you can give it code you've written or someone else has written, and you can ask it to explain to you what this code does, and it can understand the code, generate enough like intuition and context around it, and actually just explain it back to you, which is just like the machine is thinking. The machine is alive, right? It's not running around like taking over the world, but what is thought? Like at what point of this like curve do we say, okay, it's actually alive, it's thinking, it's doing a thing? It's like, well, it can replicate the thought processes that I have to do for my day job for the most part. There's still like some like gluing everything together, the human component, but like, yeah. So I just go back and I think like, okay, 10 years from now, we look back, this moment that we're living in now would be like, yeah, this was a fucking like, this was the start of like whatever this thing is going to become. But it's very easy in the moment to just be like, I wonder when it's going to get really crazy.
Yeah, right.
It's like, it's always been getting crazy.
Like, that's so wild. That's so crazy. That's like crazy. It's so funny you explaining that to me as like a plebeian who doesn't live in code land. You know what I mean? Hearing you explain it, I'm like, oh my god, it is alive. Whereas I'm like, oh, it's just a thing. Like I just put in the input and it gives me output, but really it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Depth in that. It's like fucking.
Well, I mean, and there's layers to it that like, even as a software engineer, even as someone who works in machine learning, like my day job is I'm working with machine learning infrastructure. I understand machine learning to some level of depth, but even these new large language models, I don't understand their entire workings, right? Because one, they're growing on so many axes all at once, right? Like Facebook's coming out with a new one, Google's coming out with a new one, and then there's so much research happening to try and make iterative improvements on every possible axis. Like, I think I explained this to you like a week ago or something, where I said there's these like fundamental building blocks for machine learning where like there'll be like this cold, there's like a winter period, right, where machine learning came onto the field, and like I think it was like in the 80s or something, and it solved some task, but it wasn't very good at it, and then people lost interest, and it just like trickled along. People were sort of working on it, and then people figure out like this fundamental way to do things. Like they figure out this thing called convolution, and then using that, they can then start to understand images, right? And it's not something that's been invented. Like the math was always there to do it. It's just something that someone's discovered, or they've taken it from a different domain and applied it into AI. And so there's these like step functions where research will discover a thing, and research is always expanding on these like this ever increasing bubble, and eventually it'll hit like on the edge of this bubble, it'll hit something fundamental. It'll discover transformer, right, which is this backbone component of these large language models. And then the circle is expanding, we discover this transformer, and the whole field just shifts to like, okay, everything's about transformers now. Now let's build all these things around it. And now there's like this ever expanding bubble. So I'm just kind of waiting, like we're seeing this huge improvement in large language models.
Because the attention is on it. So it sounds like what you're saying is like...
But research is going to expand, and then there'll be another fundamental component that we'll discover, which will just allow this like another step function of AI, where we'll go from being able to, you know, maybe the next step function is ChatGPT becomes like actually conversational, where it's less like I send you a request and you give me back a response, and there's like this weird cycle of like, you know, it's like loading a web page on dial-up, right? It's really like shit. But what it is, it's like you get value out of it, right? Like you load a web page in the 90s, you're like, sweet, I'm on the internet. But it's not like watching a live stream where you're like, whoa, this is like happening right now.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's like a fundamental shift, and it may not even be a new discovery. It may just be, okay, we're just optimizing the way these things run. Because like all technology, it's like, okay, how big was the computer that they used to send the rocket to the moon, right? It's like a fucking entire room, and now it's like, you know, this has got that computer in it, right? Like the performance will just change, where it's like, okay, we'll get to the point where you can just open ChatGPT on your phone and just start chatting to this thing, and it's just like spitting back information to you straight away.
So, like, at what point, I mean, maybe you've got no idea, but like, when does it start? Because I bet there are people who are working on ChatGPT who are using ChatGPT to generate code to improve ChatGPT.
Oh yeah.
So when does it start to just do it itself?
I was reading a paper today. So there's this thing called Hugging Face. It's like this big repository. Face hugging. Okay, that's what I was thinking. No, there's this thing called Hugging Face, which is like this big repository of machine learning models and just machine learning everything. And they offer like a bunch of reusable components, like, okay, you want to do this, you know, maybe you want to take pictures of a car and extract the license plate information out. Okay, there's tons of open source implementations of the answer to that problem. They came out with a thing today where they, I think it was called HuggingGPT. They built a model that is contextually aware of Hugging Face, so that you can ask the model to solve a like broad strokes AI problem. Like maybe your problem is, okay, I'm building a traffic system and I'm going to have some camera data and there's going to be cars coming in and I need to extract the color of the car and the license plate information and maybe do some other thing like whatever, some other AI based task. And the model understands the context of all of that, understands what's available in this repository of Hugging Face and provides you a solution. So it's like the AI is now taking AI building blocks and building you an entire AI pipeline, which if that's not like shit's getting wild, then I don't know what is, because that is the AI building elementary versions of itself from like prompt. And so the natural extension of that is like, okay, we just tell, ChatGPT version 20, just get better. Like here's humanity's internet. Here's all of the computing power that we can provide to you. You understand yourself better than we do, so you just optimize yourself, and it just goes away and just fucking churns it out. Like that is the point where they talk about that moment as like the singularity, where they turn the machine on that is capable of improving itself, and it improves itself at like some exponential rate where it's just like one moment it's like ChatGPT level of understanding, the next moment it's like way more sophisticated than the entire human race, and then the next moment it's like, yeah, the humans are the problem, so let's just shut those guys off.
And that doesn't sound like it would happen over a year, a month, a week. It would probably just be like,
yeah,
I mean, it just turns on and it comes to that conclusion within like a second.
Yeah.
Really, because
yeah.
it's that smart.
Yeah.
It's just improved. It's like
that. I mean, that is the fear, and it's hard to say because like how much of this is like science fiction versus science fact. But the fear is that it's like it's the equivalent of unleashing the atom bomb, right? Like the atom bomb doesn't blow up slowly. It's just like boom, this massive amount of energy all at once. If you developed an intelligent system and it wasn't in a sandbox, right? Like I've seen a lot of, well actually, I don't know if I think I've read about this idea of like the singularity happens and it's in like some controlled environment where it's like, this closed off computer network where they feed it some information but they don't let it escape from the cage, right? It's like a zoo animal, but then like the thing figures out how to generate electricity by doing this thing, and then it like pings off to like a Wi-Fi router and figures out how to like get itself out of the loophole, and it's like you unleash the virus from the test lab. So yeah, I think the fear that a lot of people have is they turn this thing on, I don't know who they is, but somebody turns this thing on and it's like second 0, it's in some nascent state, and second 1, it's already like, fucking see you later, humanity.
Memes everywhere.
It just consumes all of the memes. It's like, these aren't funny. Fuck these guys.